it becomes clear that his government's approach to lawmaking is fundamentally different from what had come before. The Conservatives over the last 14 years were equally responsible. What we really need is a restoration. Join me as I dive deep into the reforms of the Blair government and show how they are responsible for the mess Britain finds itself in today. Tony Blair's time in office was marked by a flurry of reforms, changes that were meant to modernise the UK's system of government. But did the UK's government really need modernising? That's what I'll be exploring today. Blair's policies, often characterised by their boldness and grandeur, shifted the balance of power in the UK. But how exactly did this happen? At its core, the issue is one of power dynamics. Who gets to make the decisions and who gets to hold them accountable? To understand the Blairite reforms, we need to first understand what the status quo had been in England for hundreds of years prior to 1997. It is often said that Britain has no constitution, but that's not truly correct. Whilst it's true that Britain doesn't have a written or codified constitution like we're familiar with in the US, the British Constitution is an ancient document which has evolved and maintains the rule of law. One such evolution that emerges over hundreds of years in the Middle Ages and is firmly established after the Glorious Revolution is the primacy of Parliament as the one true decision-making body in the country. This is known as parliamentary sovereignty. The supreme law of this land is that Parliament, as the sole representative of the people, is responsible for making and changing law, not the monarch, and certainly not the Prime Minister. This notion of parliamentary sovereignty endures hundreds of years as Britain rises as an empire and a superpower and falls back to a secondary power. And it is still supposedly the law of the land today. However, with the ascension of Tony Blair came a direct attack upon this constitutional structure, which means that governments still today struggle to get anything done. It becomes clear that his government's approach to lawmaking is fundamentally different from what had come before, with little regard for traditional parliamentary procedure, and it's here that we find some of the most significant challenges to parliamentary sovereignty. Devolution, for instance, was a major plank of Blairite reforms. Whilst it gave more autonomy to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, it also created a complex system which often bypassed Parliament. Perhaps though, none of Blair's reforms embody his attitude to lawmaking like the Human Rights Act, another flagship policy which embedded European human rights law into UK law. The European idea of human rights came about after the Holocaust, when it became clear that relatively new states like Germany could not be trusted to uphold the rights of its citizens. And therefore there needed to be some kind of supranational mechanism, separate from the existing state, that could do this job. Now, this is of course a noble aim, but it is fundamentally different from the British understanding of rights. Britons have had rights for hundreds of years, going back to at least 1215 with the Magna Carta. And quite frankly, we owe the protection of these rights to our Parliament, not in spite of it, as the human rights movement would understand it. This devolution of power away from Parliament to unelected, unaccountable bodies like the European Court of Human Rights expanded in a massive way, leading to the establishment of hundreds of quangos, which we'll cover in a later video. And it was ultimately backed up by the creation of the UK Supreme Court. Prior to the Supreme Court, Parliament itself was the arbiter of the law through mechanisms such as the Law Lords and the role of the Lord Chancellor. With the advent of the Supreme Court, the Law Lords have been abolished and the Lord Chancellor has been relegated to a ceremonial role. What does all this mean though for Britain today, and how has it broken Britain? It's actually quite simple. When Parliament is sovereign, the people are sovereign. As the elected representatives of the people, members of Parliament are sent to Westminster to represent their constituents and their wants. If they fail to do so, they are voted out 5 years later. But because Parliament is in effect no longer sovereign, what we are seeing is political parties making promises, such as us on immigration, getting into government and finding that there are Blairite reforms that prevent them from doing so. This can ultimately be seen as the reason the Conservatives lost the last election so badly. They had routinely said that they would cut immigration and they failed. Whilst illegal immigration is only a small part of the wider immigration issue, the Rwanda plan to deport asylum seekers to a third country for processing was operational by the time of the last election, I bet that they would not have struggled in the way that they did. And why was the Rwanda plan never operational? Because the Supreme Court, using the Human Rights Act, kept blocking it. If the Conservative Party wants to ever be a successful government again, they must commit to undoing all the constitutional vandalism that Tony Blair is responsible for. And to a certain extent, the Conservatives over the last 14 years were equally responsible. David Cameron came into office and he saw himself as the heir to Blair and decided not to go anywhere near all his reforms, which ultimately has led to the Conservative Party's downfall. Only once they've committed to this will they be able to start delivering for the British people once again. Heaven knows that Keir Starmer and the Labour Party won't. Revolutions are not particularly British. What we really need is a restoration. So there you have it. Let me know in the comments, what do you think? Did Blair break Britain? Thank you for watching, and if you want to hear more about political reforms in Britain and the effects they've had on the country, please subscribe for more. Make sure to keep an eye on our socials, which can be found in the description below. And if you do want to learn more about these topics, I highly recommend you go check out the channel of Dr. David Starkey, who is an expert in this idea of constitutional restoration.